Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Paul Mancini with ASMGI. We have a very compelling topic and webinar for everybody today. This could be actually called the year of cybersecurity this past year. A lot of breaches, a lot of activity. Cybersecurity has certainly moved well beyond the individual viruses on people's computers into the mainstream, and the data breaches are both notorious and very expensive for the companies that are dealing with them. So without further delay, let me introduce Steve Racing from ASMGI, and Steve will introduce our other speakers today. Steve, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thanks to all of our attendees for sharing some of your time today. You know, as Paul mentioned, it's definitely, I guess depends on how you look at it, right? It's an exciting topic. If you're a bad guy, you probably made some money in 2019. If you're a good guy, you probably spent some money. So I don't know, but the reality is it was a banner year from a statistics standpoint for sure, and it's certainly worth taking a look at you know what happened in 2019 and to better position ourselves for success in 2020. So I have a great panel of experts with me today. And just Frank Danko, our CIO here at ASMGI. First of all, I guess I should note Steve Racing here. I'm the CEO of ASMGI, and joining me is Frank Danko, our CIO, Director of Strategic Initiatives. And you know, Frank,
thanks for having me. Definitely appreciate it.
Yep, great. And Ken Makoid, the Regional Vice President of Northeast Sales from Flexential. Thanks for joining us, Ken.
Steve, thanks for having us. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you guys today. Thank you.
Yep, and Ken will bring some unique perspective certainly to the table as well from you know, from the data center side and the things that they're seeing. I very excited to have Frank and Ken both with us today. So, just quick agenda. Really, what we're going to try to do today is we have a lot of content. And the topic we could spend, you know, days on probably, and we're going to try to do this in an hour. So the way we're going to do that is just try to take a quick look at 2019 and reflect on some of the key things I think that are really driving strategic decisions in 2020, right? So it's really how do we leverage what we saw in the rearview mirror to help us, you know, better look forward and project for 2020. And then we're going to actually take a look at 2020 and share a little bit of what we see as trends that are carryovers from 2019 in some cases, and you know, some new modern technology and things like that. But we'll go so far as to actually make some speaker predictions. So, and we expect you all to hold us to that, right? So we're going to make sure those are written down so when we do the look back at 2020, we can see how we did, right? But I also want to talk a little bit about, you know, how do you win? The odds are seemingly not real good, right? They're kind of stacked against us. So how do we win against the bad guys? So we'll talk through that a little bit and then make a couple of announcements. So just to get started, some cyber highlights of 2019. So let's take a look at, you know, and again, this stuff, a lot of these statistics come from breach reports. There are several out there. A lot of people are doing breach reports. All the big four do them. Ponemon and IBM, the two most popular, I think, are probably the Verizon data breach report and the, you know, Ponemon IBM. But, you know, from a Ponemon standpoint, the cost of a data breach, it continues to go up. So this is, again, I'll try to get through this material pretty quickly and not dig too deep into analysis of the actual statistic. But the thing that's interesting to me is that the cost to an enterprise of a data breach continues to go up, right? You know, in 2019, it was $3.92 million. 2018, the year before, was $3.86 million. It's probably going to keep going up. Just a couple other things from this. You know, the U.S. is the most expensive country for a data breach. Probably not a surprise to most of you out there. We have a lot of compliance, regulatory requirements, and those kind of things that are all driving cost. Healthcare, the most expensive industry. Again, probably not a big surprise. There's a lot of value placed on records, healthcare records, and various different things you can do with the information you achieve or acquire from a healthcare data breach. The average size of a data breach, 25,000, almost 26,000 records. So pretty interesting from that perspective. But if you dig in a little bit on that data, and particularly from this report, there are a couple things I really wanted to highlight on this next slide. So how do you actually decrease that's the average cost. Some are higher, some are lower, various different things. But there are some things that we can do as practitioners that help us lower those costs. And a couple of these worth noting if you look at the top, even the top 10, but the top couple of them, like incident response, practice. We always talk about that. We're going to talk about it a little bit later. But if you do these things and have a good level of maturity in your incident response program, you have an opportunity to lower your cost versus the average from a data breach standpoint, right? Use of encryption. How many times, if somebody gains access to your database, for example, and the records are just clearly visible, you're in big trouble, right? But encryption can help in a lot of different ways. So implementing some of these things. But it's worth noting, again, the hierarchy of things that you can do to help drive a reduction in that average cost. There are also things that are driving, the cost. So these are factors that both increase and decrease the cost of a data breach. But again, worth noting, and all this information will be available to all of the attendees afterwards. But Verizon data breach report, again, one of the other more popular ones. There are a couple things I really wanted to highlight on this. One is, who are the victims? And two is, who's behind the breaches, right? So who are the victims? You can see, on the slide, various breakdowns, but a big element, almost 50%, 43% are basically small businesses, right? So third-party risk, we know, is prevalent in a lot of compliance requirements and a lot of audit requirements for highly regulated industries, banking and finance. FFIEC is driving a lot of that stuff. But this, attackers are, smart, and they know that big banks and big health systems and big enterprises in general are spending a lot on security. So why not go with somebody who's theoretically more likely to have a lower security posture and use them as access into the larger organization. So public sector, we're seeing a large rise in ransomware and various different things for cities, Atlanta and Baltimore, and just some of the things that we've seen. So I thought it was worth highlighting those. Who's behind these breaches? Where are they coming from? 70%, 69% according to this, are perpetrated by outsiders. So, malicious attacks from outsiders are driving a lot of data breaches, organized crime, nation-state attacks, and those kind of things. That they're all up. They're all increasing, right? And if you can capture 1 billion records, even if the cost per record is coming down, over time the total cost of the data breach is going up, and you have an opportunity as an attacker to make some good money. So we're seeing a lot. 34% according to this report, internal actors. So a lot of mistakes are being made still by end users. It's not necessarily malicious if it's an inside breach, right? It could be accidental, and we see a lot of those things happening. So if we break this down a little bit further from the same report, we're seeing 51% malicious or criminal activity. Again, this is from the report. System glitch and human error. One of the things I think worth pointing out about these reports is that you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, and please don't make the strategic decisions based on this information. But it is worth, from a look-back standpoint, leveraging it from a, where do we best protect ourselves perspective. But system glitches are anything from misconfigurations to, application errors, like if you build an application that isn't patched or doesn't have a patch for a security vulnerability. I mean, that's counted as a system glitch, right? So human error is basically, leaving something exposed in clear text to the internet, and somebody acquires it that way. Or, a lot of people are posting, using free file share or free file storage, right, and posting sensitive data. So those types of things are counted as human errors. But it's important to note, I think, that about half, or a little over half, of the data breaches that have occurred, again, from quantity of data breaches, not from number of records, but from quantity of data breaches, more than half are malicious and from outside. If we look at human error, particularly human error in detail, and just kind of break it down, 34% from phishing. And so really all I wanted to highlight here, without getting into a lot of the explanation of the material, is just that email continues to be one of the top attack vectors, right? So phishing emails, we've probably everybody out there has gotten them. I just got one the other day, which was asking for my credentials to Office 365. It was very professional looking, Microsoft logo, the whole 9 yards.
It's almost impossible to distinguish.
It's almost impossible to distinguish. Now, and I had the benefit of just actually reading an article about this particular phishing attack. It's in the wild, right? And it's going crazy. So I actually had an example of that in my inbox, right? So, but, being very careful about emails is critical, and I see a lot more enterprises really now engaged in email security and phishing security and those kind of things, but the attackers are getting smarter and more mature as well. So just because you're expecting a package from UPS does not mean you should click on the tracking link when you get an email from UPS. It's just, that's the nature of the world that we live in, and so that's the point of this, I think, is that email still, continues to be a primary attack vector. If we look at just attack distribution, and this is 2018 data, so it's a little bit dated, but for all intent and purposes, it's probably current. What we're seeing is malware, and even point of sale malware is probably the largest sector. And again, how do you classify an exploit? It probably fits into a lot of these classifications, and it has to end up in one bucket from a statistics standpoint. So we won't go into that so much, but I think the key takeaway from this in a look-back perspective is that, malware is basically malicious software of any kind. So anytime there's a payload dropped, whether you're clicking on a link in an email and it results in downloading a file, it's probably getting put in the malware bucket. And as a mechanism for the bad guys to deposit things on our network and find other vulnerabilities and spread and propagate and those kind of things, it continues to be a primary target, and some other things. So, okay, so this is where things start to really get interesting, I think. And this report from Cyber Risk Analytics is just the first half of 2019, but the trends continued throughout the year. But what I found most interesting in this is the rise from 2018 to 2019. So if we talk about the number of breaches, it's unbelievable, the number of breaches between 2018 and 2019, how much the increase. This is the first half of the year in 2018 versus the first half of the year in 2019. just the rapid increase quantitatively in the number of breaches that are occurring. And we'll talk a little bit later about some ongoing trends and carryovers from 2019 to 2020, but these are driven by a lot of different things like automation and various different things. People are making mistakes in configuration at a faster rate because people are deploying things in environments that are conducive to that at a faster rate, right? So it doesn't not make sense, but it's astounding to see the number of data breaches in the first half of 2019. But it's not just the number of data breaches, it's the quantity of records in data breaches total, and we're going to drill into that a little bit. But over 4 billion records in the first half of 2019 alone, 4 billion plus records. It's astounding when you think about that, when you think about it that way. So if we break that down and we look at what are the top 10 breaches in the first half of 2019, and again, it's a little bit hard to read this data, but the reason it's here is, and what I wanted to highlight was just the number of records that are exposed from these data breaches, right? These are, and again, no surprise, these are the top 10 by number of records. So, but if you look at the number of records exposed, in these breaches, it's astounding. 983 million records, 885 million records, 540 million records. It's astronomical, right? And all of these data breaches, there's some type of personally identifiable information. It could be healthcare information, it could be social security number, login credentials, credit card numbers, all of these things. It depends on what data, but the quantity of records that are exposed is just astronomical. So then if we compare this to what are the top 10 breaches of all time, this is interesting to me because three of the top 10 lists in 2019 are on the top 10 list of all time. 30% basically.
I think that trend's going to continue to grow as well. I can talk about that in my predictions.
Yeah, great. So we'll hear more from Frank about that a little bit later on, but that is exactly the point. I mean, the trend is growing, it isn't shrinking, and we see this problem, growing in orders of magnitude even. So it's not an if, it's a when, right? But some of the other things that are interesting about this data, you see, like the Yahoo breach is on here. They actually had 2 breaches in 2016, and they were in the second half of the year, so they weren't reflected on the previous data, but they're listed here. 500 million records in one of them, 3 billion records in one of them in 2016. These were huge data breaches, and it's just astounding, right? So I think the one, Yahoo breach of 3 billion records is probably going to be on the top 10 list for a while, but maybe not too long, a couple of years, who knows. Okay, so continuing on this look back, if we look at the historical breach data, so whether you know it or not, the thing that's interesting to me about breach data is it's by default it's skewed, and that is most of us don't want to report breaches, so unless you're required, it probably goes unreported, right? Most of the look back at breach data and the stuff that shows up in reports is from reported data breaches, which is probably a fraction of the total, right? How accurately is it reported? Who knows? The investigators, they know what they know, and what gets reported, and then it gets classified and those kind of things. But if we do look at historical breach data, there are a lot of different things we can extrapolate from that. And AI and machine learning are being used as a tool to do this in a lot of cases. But quantifying cyber risk that way that's one way to quantify cyber risk is to look at the things that have happened in the past. But if we do a look back in the data set, the breach data set from historical data, we see the three main controls that show up are basically controlled access. Again, probably not a big surprise. If you are not controlling access to who has access to your sensitive data, that's a problem, and it's probably going to get exploited. Data protection. Again, it's all about the data at the end of the day, right? So put protection around the crown jewels, and particularly if something is sensitive. And implement a security awareness training program. Again, probably not a big surprise. Awareness of users to do the right thing and know what to do and know how to identify attack and those kind of things continues to be critically important. So I had a couple slides that were specific to financial services, and I didn't put these in here to do a vertical. We could, again, spend a day specifically on financial services or healthcare or any manufacturing, any other vertical of higher education. But the reason I put those in there, I'm not going to spend really any time on this slide, but this next slide has an interesting statistic in it that this is from the Verizon breach data report, by the way, which is it's a common annual report every year, and so a lot of people leverage that to make strategic decisions. But I mentioned that these breach reports are or can be somewhat skewed, but this gives you a good example. Banking Trojan botnets. If that was excluded from the Verizon breach data report, and the reason it was excluded is because if they included it, it would have been a 27,000% of the total number of breaches. 40,000 successful breaches happened because of botnets, right? Which is basically a hacker tool for automating, finding vulnerabilities and or exploiting vulnerabilities. 40,000 successful data breaches in 2019. So there were 146 confirmed data breaches in that vertical without that 40,000. So you can see that it's a very lopsided amount. The other thing that's interesting is denial of service, 56% of the incidents, right? So this is, I think, a concern moving forward, and we'll talk about this a little more in the predictions, but denial of service isn't about stealing data. It's about disrupting operations, which is clearly a security incident and can clearly have implications and longstanding reputational implications, but can have point-in-time cost implications for sure for a lot of enterprises. But I put this in here because just because it's interesting, and botnets as a category unto itself, and this is one of the trends I think that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, but botnets, we're seeing a lot of automation and being used from the attacker standpoint, so it's even harder to protect against that. So, okay, so the moment that you've all been waiting for, we have our crystal ball. If you have one, that's great. We have our crystal ball out. We're going to talk a little bit about 2020. So, 2019, again, we saw a lot of increases in quantitatively and qualitatively from the breach standpoint. So what do you think we're going to see in 2020? So I'll just pause for a second, see if Frank or Ken have anything they want to interject from the first segment.
I think it's just a symptom of the rising complexity of the world that we live in. I mean, it's there's no question that there's a business driver from the standpoint of it's big business to actually go and do the breaches, take the whatever the records that are available and then use that to whatever for sale, whatever the case may be. So, unfortunately, that's feeding things, and then it's just a matter of who's winning the battle, unfortunately, of keeping up with that threat.
Yeah. Who is winning the battle?
You're asking me that? I mean,
yeah.
Unfortunately, I think, you hear about a lot of the records or the numbers of the breaches that you're just, disclosing or discussing. I think that's a fraction of what's actually occurring. So at least right now, I think the bad guys are winning the battle, unfortunately. And that's without even factoring all the things that are not disclosed from a nation-state attack perspective.
Yep.
And intellectual property stuff. And
what do you think, Ken? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I could tell you, as a data center provider, right, and really catering to the highly compliant industries, our costs continue to rise, right, to just defend this. So yeah, to Frank's point, I would say with our costs continuing to rise on compliance and security, I would say that the attackers are actually winning the battle at this point. But lot of good things happening in the cyber industry, I think, going into 2020, which gives us some strong defenses. And it's an exciting time on both sides.
Yep. Okay, so let's dig in. Let's dig into some of the things. I'll say predictions and trends and predictions, right? So a lot of these things are carryovers from 2019, and we'll get into the hardcore predictions shortly. But number one, again, a lot of these things are probably not a surprise, but the phishing landscape's changing. There are a lot of newer terms, relatively speaking. It's not just about phishing, which are videos that are doing with malicious intent that are being issued. Text, mobile devices and text messaging is being used for phishing attacks and various different things. But the landscape of phishing is changing, and a lot of what we're seeing is, one of our partners that know before that focuses on this industry. I know they talked a lot about, for example, if you're having a company picnic even, and you got some employees who are posting on social media that, hey, see you at the picnic on Saturday, right? And then bam, that information is leveraged by an attacker to send an email from the CEO that says, hey, at the company picnic on Saturday, we're going to give away, some Amazon gift cards. Please, buy them with a corporate credit card, and then or take a picture of the front and back, or do whatever, right? So there are all these different ways that that phishing attacks are exploiting us as enterprises, and it's a little scary and daunting, quite honestly, because
the sharing economy is not good from that standpoint.
That's right.
Social part of it.
Yep. But again, so you could extract an element of education from this and educate your users. And I know one of the things like we did internally was when I learned about that, that Office 365 phishing exploit that was going out, I let everybody know that, hey, look out for this. And if you see an email that's asking for login credentials, basically, to Office 365, don't do it, even if you feel compelled to do it, right? And I had one. Sitting in my inbox. So I think this trend is going to continue. I think we're going to see a lot of very creative and very mature structure to phishing attacks in 2020, and I just don't see that changing. Number two, increased use of mobile as an attack vector. Again, I think it's again, it's a little bit of a carryover from 2019, and it's not rocket science. Call me Joe Obvious, but as the number of applications and uses of mobile increase, so will the attack vectors. But almost every application that you interface with today has some mobile component to it, and
the combination of enterprises have done a pretty decent job with protecting their endpoints, for the employee-issued devices, but you look at all the use of mobile devices or bring your own devices,
right?
And there's really some control over that from a corporate perspective, but a lot of employees install all types of apps on there, and you look at the apps that are malware that then could very easily cross over and compromise enterprise applications.
Yep.
or security breaches.
Yep. Yeah, and this brings up an interesting point, Frank, from that perspective. And Ken, I think it ties into a lot of the data center stuff that you're probably seeing. But there was an initiative, a cloud first initiative. It was a front running strategy to go cloud first and move workloads to the cloud, right? And people are finding that there are a lot of reasons why that may or may not make sense, right? But a couple of those reasons are, if you have a legacy enterprise architecture like MPLS and you move all your workloads to the cloud, it doesn't work anymore, right? That whole centralized architecture of backhauling to it. So, moving some workloads to the cloud may make sense, but moving all workloads to the cloud probably doesn't make sense. And I think one of the trends that come out of that from an IT standpoint, Ken, but it ties in really closely to this, is just the hybrid model.
I would say.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, being a data center provider and a cloud provider, right? With our edge, we have edge centers out there, right? And I would say most mid and large enterprise have some hybrid strategy where they're using a combination of either on-prem workloads. Sometimes those are sitting in co-location centers like my own, but they also use the cloud for certain workloads, right? And some workloads absolutely should be in the hyperscalers, and other workloads, they need that elasticity, and they fall on other cloud capabilities that we offer where it sits in the middle, right? So those private cloud capabilities, those multi-tenant cloud capabilities, but it's typically a hybrid solution that most mid and large enterprise, even small enterprise, utilize. But with that, it creates, with that hybrid capability, it creates a lot of opportunity for cyber risk and cyber intrusion. So companies have to be very, very diligent in that process.
Yep, roger that. And the other thing I think that, Frank, that you mentioned that is challenging for enterprises, the BYOD scenario, and there was a big push towards BYOD as a cost-cutting measure, right? Instead of buying a company-owned phone or mobile device for your employees, allowing them to bring their own and putting mobile device management in play to be able to secure them and various different things. But just a litany of challenges. But as our corporate networks evolve and become more and more, I'll say, readily embrace modern technology and modern architectures, it becomes even harder to secure.
Yeah, with the gig economy, contract resources, I mean, that definitely is a contributing factor as well.
Yep. So trend number 3, I put the targeting of local governance and enterprises via ransomware. There's a rise in ransomware attacks. The MongoDB thing is a perfect example of this. I don't know how many people are familiar with that particular breach, but there was a vulnerability found in MongoDB that it was an automated configuration setting that in older versions, left things unprotected, default passwords basically. In more modern versions, the default setting was turn on the control around that and force it, but a lot of people could easily turn it back off again, right? But a lot of people are running older versions, and so default configurations, we saw this in 2017, I think, is a real driver for a lot of the large public data breaches with, the public clouds, Amazon and Microsoft, both misconfiguring to leave, S3 buckets in Amazon, leaving data exposed because there was no password on the, on the storage of data. But, malware, in the MongoDB thing, there were 12,500 cases of malware that were deployed, people lost all their data stored in a MongoDB because some attacker, saw this vulnerability published and exploited it himself and removed all the data and just left a note that said, if you want your data back, call this number and pay me this much money, right? That's it's staggering when you think about these types of things. But I'll say the relevance of malware of ransomware in general, and local governments have seen a rise in malware. Healthcare has seen a rise in malware. Higher education is seeing a rise in malware. But again, you have to be exploited in order for malware to happen, right? So there are a lot of different ways that you can prevent it. But in 2020, I don't see this trend changing.
With the phishing and social engineering component,
right.
They two go
right.
closely together.
Right. So the kill chain, if you will. So if you imagine a phishing email comes in with a link in it, somebody clicks on the link, a payload is downloaded that includes malware, and ransomware is the end game, right? So it removes your data or encrypts your data and asks for money. So those are, how do you classify that breach? Those are a lot of different things that, that are happening in order to be successful. But ransomware in general, I don't see that trend changing in 2020. I think we'll continue to see a rise in ransomware attacks. Trend number 4, increasing emphasis on data privacy, sovereignty and compliance. Again, I don't think we're slowing down on that. I do know that the current administration in the U.S. is looking at lightening some compliance requirements around Sarbanes-Oxley and things like that have really induced, I'll say, a lot of spending from a control standpoint. And the debate, you could spend an entire day debating whether that's good for enterprises or it ends up just being a cost of doing business. But data privacy in general, particularly from a PII standpoint, from a consumer standpoint, is on the rise. There's no question. GDPR went into effect. That's driving a lot of change in a lot of states. The consensus in the U.S. is that every state is going to kind of leverage GDPR as a model to deploy their own. U.S. is talking about doing a national framework for privacy and those kind of things. I don't know how we'll get there or how soon we'll get there, but I don't see privacy and compliance slowing down in 2020. I see it ramping up.
Oh, and that's the thing that's kind of a double-edged sword there. Organizations want to leverage the data that they have about, say, their customers, consumers, so forth, but at the same time, they have to be serious about protecting that data. So, unfortunately, this is one of the things that's all organizations that have that data don't take those responsibilities seriously, and then in turn government has to legislate some of those requirements.
Yep. And Ken, I know that you guys are compliant to a lot of different frameworks and various different things. I mean, what do you have any thoughts about if this is where this is headed in 2020?
Yeah, so for us, I mean, again, we cater to the highly regulated industry. So for us, it's we're constantly diligent, right? I would probably say when we meet with customers, it's always security and compliance. It's the first thing that's on the table, right? If we can't make customers feel comfortable with our capabilities to meet their compliance needs and their security concerns, we can't get to stage 2, right, with these clients. And so this will just continue to be an increasing expense for us, but no question, it will always be a high priority for us with our customers.
Excellent. Yeah, no argument for sure. Trend number 5, increasing investments in cybersecurity automation. So a lot of our customers have been pretty forthright. It's hard. Automation is hard. It can be difficult and things like that. And my response is generally, it may take 2 years to reach a level of maturity that you're comfortable with, but it's going to take 2 years even if you wait 2 years. So start now, right? And I see this trend increasing in 2020, and a lot of vendors are deploying automation tools within their platforms and packages. And I think from an overall mentality standpoint, a lot of enterprises are really adopting a strategy of automation, and part of it is driven by the fact that there's too much to do for human. You can't hire enough people to actually get things done, right? The things that you need to do. And so if you're not automating some of those tasks, I mean, looking at logs is a perfect example, right?
The days of doing all these functions manually are over, or have been for a long time. And even the example that we were talking about a phishing email, someone clicking on something, a payload being dropped. I mean, if there was automation in place, that could limit the potential damage that scenario could cause, versus it being manually detected through some manual inspection of logs or just users reporting the issue. You know, by that time, it could already be detrimental to the business.
Yep. Automation is interesting because a lot of times people say, well, why don't you just, like from a phishing standpoint, why don't you just block the links? But it's very difficult to know if a link is valid or not. And, you know, you can have DLP rules in place, and you can have web filtering rules in place and allow certain apps or not allow certain sites and do various different things. But the tighter you set your filters and controls, the harder it is for people to do the things that they need to do. And if you're in a business like most people are, a lot of tools are web-based, right? So you can only whitelist so much in modern architectures and modern technology landscapes. It's very difficult to do that. So I think it's better to make an assumption that you can't do that. And so then how do you put controls in place that, you know, that say, okay, you're going to get attacked, and that phishing email is going to get through in certain cases, right? Somebody's going to click on that link. And one of the ways to do that is by automation. And so an example of that might be click on the link, a payload is downloaded, and you're looking at anomaly detection or anomalous behavior based on machine learning on what's a normal behavior for somebody in the mailroom or somebody in HR or somebody.
Tools are out there.
Right. And then you can segment networks and do all kinds of various different things. So lots of things going on in that space. Number 6, increasing use of IoT and OT as an attack vector. Again, I think this is going to increase a lot in 2020, and mostly just because the number of devices that people are trying to leverage that are connecting to their business networks is increasing.
5G.
And 5G is coming out, and so
it's going to accelerate that process.
Again, yeah, it's not rocket science. If the number of devices increase, then the number of attack vectors increase. But the challenge I think that enterprises are faced with today, you know, enterprises are looking to the manufacturers of these devices and saying that you have to make these devices more secure, right? So if a device is built today, it may be built with security. To your early comment, Ken, I mean, people may be thinking about security right out of the gate, right? Or not, but potentially they are. But if it's a legacy device, and there are all these legacy devices that people are finding ways now to connect to the business network and the IT network, if it's a legacy device that is not already built in, forget about it. You can't put an agent on it. You can't discover it. You can't do a lot of different things. And so as those devices become more a part of our normal day-to-day, I think just, you know, exploiting those vulnerabilities is going to be on the rise for sure. And to your point, with 5G, you know, the number of exploits is going to increase a lot. So increasing the number of magnitude of breaches. Again, not much to say about this. We saw a huge rise in 2019. I think the same thing will be true in 2020. The growing impact of AI and machine learning on cyber. We already talked about automation. Automation generally occurs because of artificial intelligence to some extent and machine learning to some extent, right? So building automation, you could say, is an AI function for sure. Learning from experience, if the application learns on its own, you know, categorically by definition, it is machine learning. So I think this is kind of it goes hand in hand with the automation trend, but we see a lot of, you know, AI machine learning is growing, to your point earlier, Ken. I mean, it's growing as a trend in the industry. So there are a lot of value drivers to businesses from an IT standpoint that are starting to leverage AI and machine learning more pervasively, and we're seeing a lot of edge computing and various different things that are driven by that. But cyber is no exception, you know, automating activities and leveraging that technology to do that. But, you know, the other point worth making here is it's also a trend happening for the bad guys, right? Automating attacks and using bots and doing those kind of things and getting smarter about how to do this. Like, imagine if you send, you know, 100 million phishing emails out or 1 billion phishing emails out, and you have machine learning to identify the ones that are working and the ones that aren't, and you just send more of the ones that are working, right, and less of the ones that aren't. So it would be naive for us to assume that AI and machine learning is only a tool that we can leverage to protect ourselves. It's also a tool that the bad guys are leveraging to make it easier to do attacks. Trend number 9, emphasis on quantifying cyber risk. So this has been I'll say 2019 was kind of an introductory year in a lot of ways for the evolution or maturity of this. The concept of quantifying risk is not new. It's been around for decades. I think people, aside from cyber, in business continuity and disaster recovery and various different other types of enterprise risk, have been leveraging quantified risk models for a long time. A lot of the software that's available, platform software to do that, has been leveraging the concepts of quantifying risk. But cyber, from my observation, cyber has been excluded in a lot of cases to the quantification. It's very complex. Even the breach reports, it's very difficult to identify root cause and various different things. There's generally a lot of different things, moving parts, and a lot of things have to happen. The sequence of events that have to occur for a breach to take place is phenomenal, right? It's generally not just one thing; it's a lot of things. But in general, the topic of quantifying cyber risk I see as increasing.
There has to be some way to prioritize.
Right.
That.
Right.
There's some question about it.
Yep. A lot of enterprises have been asking about it, right? So there are a lot of things like the FAIR Institute has been around for a couple of decades, a decade, I'll say, but the concept of quantifying cyber risk that FAIR Institute leveraged, scenario-based, has been around for a long time. It's pervasive in business impact analysis from whatever reason and those kind of things. But a lot of people are doing some really great work in this space, and a lot of the AI machine learning tools that we're talking about doing are analyzing both historical breach data and conventional wisdom and hands-on industry knowledge and those types of things. So I see that continuing to increase in 2020. And then the last one, number 10, cyber insurance. It's worth noting that I think in general, from our perspective, the insurance industry has been lagging a little bit. They're professional risk takers. They're writing a lot of cyber policies. It's a relatively new revenue stream for insurance companies, so they're probably talking a lot about it and doing a lot of things, but it's still a pretty vanilla approach, I think, pretty immature from an insurance position. And I think that the market will evolve so that underwriters have better visibility into actual security postures and what actual risks that they're protecting against and writing policies against. But I also see from a practitioner standpoint that it ends up being a tool that security practitioners and CISOs and chief information security officers and various different people in the field of security can better leverage cybersecurity as it evolves and matures. It ends up being a tool that you can use to actually mitigate risk, right? To lower your risk or transfer.
And your decision-making process as well.
Right. So there you have it, folks. That's kind of what we see 2020 from a broad stroke looking like. Again, there are a lot of different things. If we went through some of the different frameworks and various different controls out there, from a solution standpoint, there are a lot of different things we can talk about. But just from a trend and a prediction standpoint, that's kind of where we're at. So no pressure to the panel, but if you had to pick one thing, Ken, what do you think? What would be your number one prediction for 2020?
Steve, you're right. I have multiple, right? But hey, we have these edge centers out there, right? So really, it's the expansion of IoT that we're seeing, right? As all of our customers need to get closer and closer to their end users, and application latency is a key thing. So as more and more of these connected devices are out there, and our customers want to provide low latency solutions to these devices, it just continuously expands the threat attack surface, right? So for us, it's great. Being in the data center and cloud business, I would say that we see all the leading edge technology coming into our centers through our customers. It's the expansion of IoT, and I'd also say artificial intelligence is. It's amazing the amount of artificial intelligence deployments that are ending up on our floors these days. Certainly a lot in 2019, more so coming in 2020. I would say across all verticals are expanding and investing in AI. And hey, some of our customers are the security vendors out there, and they're investing heavily in AI as well, as you had noted, right? So for them, it's all about accuracy of biometrics, predictive analytics, enhanced learning. It's all going into these security providers, and artificial intelligence will be on both sides, on the cyber criminals as well as the security side. You'll see a huge expansion on the AI side.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think, Ken, so that's great. That's a great response, because I definitely see that as an emerging area in security, and 2020 should be just kind of a breakout year for a lot of these technologies. But I will say that from an IT standpoint, like Gartner agrees with you, right? Two of the top 10, two areas of the top 10, IoT and AI and machine learning, actually three of the top 10, and edge computing are value drivers for enterprises today. And so as they continue to expand their use of those, they'll clearly become a larger attack vector, and there'll be tools that are applied to cybersecurity. So I think that's a great pick. That's a great pick, Ken, and certainly consistent with what I think that a lot of the leading experts and thought leaders in the industry and certainly ourselves are seeing. How about Frank? What do you think, Frank? There's a lot to pick from. You got to pick one. What's it going to be?
Well, I don't mean to be gloom and doom, but I think, we were talking about the numbers of breaches in 2019, the scope of those. I think, unfortunately, that those numbers are going to be dwarfed by what we're going to continue to see going forward. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is the complexity of the threats are increasing. We talked about the use of AI, machine learning, and automation to fuel the attacks and the level of sophistication there. The amount of data that we're gathering as part of digital transformation is, if you look at the amount of whatever it is, growth of data that we're storing in the world is increasing significantly, and as a result of that, there's more data to be potentially breached or exploited. So that's another one. The other is cloud migrations are occurring and continue to occur. They're not always being done properly, and so we have the examples of wide open data on some of the public cloud providers. That definitely does not have to be the case, but that will fuel the increase of data, and then the data that then is exposed through the improper planning and architecting of those migrations. And then the other one is the rate of change, continuous integration, continuous delivery. It's difficult for the IT and security teams to keep up with the rate at which changes are occurring within applications and solutions, and that again is just going to continue to fuel the potential for breaches. So again, not to say that it's insurmountable or anything, but it's something that I think if we fast forward to a year from now, we're going to see that as a trend. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be a wake-up call for the things that everyone should be paying attention to, because of the fact that those are things that in many cases can be prevented.
Yep. Yeah, great. That's a great answer, and I certainly no argument here. I think those numbers are definitely going to go up in 2020. It's a lot of conventional wisdom around it's not if but when, right? So if you assume everybody's going to get breached, those numbers they have to get bigger, right? And they will, and so a lot of times it just becomes what can you do about it after the fact. But one of the things that you said is really interesting to me about the velocity of change. I read an article just recently, that said it's naive to assume that tomorrow will not be faster than today. And we've just, as technologists, we've experienced a tremendous increase in the pace or 2 years ago, but a decade ago or 2 decades ago, it's just incredible, how fast things change and move, and that really increases the opportunity for making mistakes, right, or the opportunity for creating vulnerabilities and those kind of things. And we're constantly being watched today by bad guys, and a lot of the tools and techniques that the bad guys that we're deploying to protect ourselves, the bad guys are deploying to watch us protect ourselves, right? And they're learning and they're maturing and getting smarter. So I definitely agree. I think the opportunity for vulnerabilities increases by virtue of a lot of the things that we're doing to drive value to our businesses, right?
Plus, I think the disclosure laws, as we talked about earlier, from a compliance requirement as part of a supply chain third-party risk, are going to drive those unreported incidents or breaches as well.
Yep.
So that's going to also add to that number, which is, again, the more visibility we collectively have on what's occurring gives us an opportunity to prevent those things.
Yep. Excellent. Well, here's mine. I'm gonna talk about. It's hard, man. It's hard. There's so much to pick from, and I will say, as a technologist, I get really excited about a lot of the things that are happening, on both sides of the fence. It seems a little bit like a challenge, really, to how do we protect ourselves against an evolving landscape of threats and various different things. But in spite of all of that, in spite of all the modern technology and how exciting it is, I think the blocking and tackling is still where it's at, and I advocate heavily for this, and my number one thing is going to be security awareness. I see 2020 as a year where we're already seeing it. People are talking about not if, but when, but I still see a lot of people who don't think it's going to happen to them. And what I'd like to share is it is going to happen to you. We have clients who are saying, nobody from a cyber standpoint really cares who we are because we're just a small maintenance shop, or we're this or we're that or the other thing. And I'm like, yeah, but your customer's GE, right? People care about that, and they care about them. And so everybody is a target.
Everybody has a client.
Everybody has a client. Everybody is a target. In my opinion, the number one way that an enterprise, in spite of all of the tools and techniques that we can deploy and have to deploy from a compliance standpoint and various different things, the number one way that we can influence protection of our environments is to educate our people, teach them not just what's out there, but how to identify it, right? How to recognize if we're being attacked. Like, some people don't know what to look for, right? Spam phishing emails, still, it continues to be a huge, huge driver for malware, propagation of various different things across enterprises. You're sitting on the inside. Somebody knocks on the door and says Candygram. You don't open the door, right? How do you know not to open the door, right? We all try to teach our kids this. I think security awareness for me is the number one way that we can influence behavioral change in our organizations, and I really think that's a key driver in creating that culture of security and various different things. And that, not to negate or anything else that's out there, but that's the number one thing for me that we can do to help influence those behaviors and have an impact on not being part of those numbers. Comment?
Yeah, my only comment, and I totally agree. I think reality is the bad actors are taking advantage of the fact that it's difficult to control everything that everyone does at any point in time. Instead of coming in trying to brute force through a firewall or something, they know that there's a higher probability they're going to be able to get somebody to click on an email.
That's right.
And gain their objectives. So they're until we figure out a way to totally control that instance or that exposure, employee awareness and training is critical.
Yep. And quite honestly, until a lot of the automated tools that we deploy
help to prevent that
are mature enough to help prevent those kind of things, right? And we're not there yet. So how do we win? I probably jumped ahead a little bit, but how do we win against this? Here are just some best practices, but I'm gonna keep moving probably a little bit quicker past that, and just talk through some of the things that we see from our perspective on how do you win, right? So as an enterprise, how do you? It feels a lot of times like a losing battle. There's no tool that we have that the bad guys don't have. It just feels like almost a sense of helplessness. We talk to our enterprises and they have competing objectives and try to do everything all at once. It doesn't work. So how do you actually win? I think from our perspective, one of the things that I like to point out is technology partner integrations. Right, as we move to a modern landscape technology and some of the key elements that we spoke about before, like automation and orchestration, become more pervasive and prevalent, we have to use that as a strategy to build our portfolio, right? So a lot of people are moving away from legacy architectures in enterprises, and even if they maintain a legacy architecture, they're still deploying cloud solutions and mobile devices at an amazing pace, and legacy architectures don't work, right? So as you start to modernize your tool landscape, make sure that you're looking for places where where the products work well together. And some of the modern technology architecture is conducive to this. Sharing data among applications, and some of it is better suited than others. But ask for help. Ask for advice on these things, because my example, and we've talked about this in a lot of different webinars, if a vendor's only responsibility is selling their platform, that's number one priority, and selling their platform, it shows up, right? If the number one priority is to really help you lower your risk or improve your security posture, then it's a much more open discussion, I think, in those kind of cases. But build a cyber ecosystem. That's my number one recommendation as you continue to adopt and deploy tools. So just some other things I think that are critical. Plan and practice. If we go back to, I'll go back to that one slide in the breach report. I won't click back to it, but I want to mention it. The factors that IBM and Ponymon mentioned that can actually lower the cost of a breach. If it's not if, but when, assume it's going to happen, and there's going to be cost involved. You're going to have to not just recover and mitigate the breach and attack surface, but you may have to pay, recovery services to consumers. You may have to do all kinds of various different things. But the number one way to mitigate that is incident response. Have a very mature incident response plan. Tabletops are a mechanism for practicing incident response plans. Do it. You don't want an actual incident to be where you're trying to figure out who to call, right? Practice it.
The cost of doing those things is less than the cost of paying ransomware after the fact.
That's right. So leverage experts, leverage expertise, and do a lot of practice. Plan and practice, I think, is a key driver for that. Oh my goodness, we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to fly through this. Educate and create a culture of security. We talked about this a little bit already. Outsource where you're limited in resources or capabilities. It looks like we're at the top of the hour. I've got a couple more things I want to just highlight, but this is a key element. We all have limitations as enterprises, whether it's headcount limitations or expertise limitations, but leverage partners, again, it ties right into that building an ecosystem, but leverage partners for either of those, right? Wherever you have a gap in your own capabilities, make sure you're leveraging a partner to do that, and have a deliberate and intentional plan for executing cyber control. Don't just try to react to the latest and greatest threat, because you're going to hear the news is going to report on a lot of different things in 2020, just like they did in 2019. And if you're trying to respond to everything that shows up in the news, or you listen to on the way to work on NPR or various different things, it's very difficult to improve your security posture in a reactionary mode like that. So the number one thing I think to combat that is to have a very intentional, deliberate, build a roadmap, base it on something, some kind of framework or some kind of quantitative risk assessment or various different things. Base it on something, and be intentional about it. So I wanted to just use one example, and Ken, this is a little bit of a softball for you here, but in the spirit of the middle bullet item, outsource where you're limited in capabilities, I just wanted to ask the question. So this ties right into what you do, Ken, but it's a great example of leveraging a strategic partner to help you move the dial on your own security postures. And the question I ask enterprises a lot are, how many of your data centers look like this? And not many of them do, but some of them do. Don't get me wrong. If you're investing heavily in the $100 to $300 million range, you probably have a data center that looks like this. But most of us don't, right? Most of us have data centers that don't look like this.
Yeah. Steve, I would say the key point to make here is that the outsource model both on the cloud and the co-location side, has become very, very stable over the last 5 to 10 years. And companies like mine, we spend heavily on the compliance and security side, and we have the ability to spread that cost across all of our customers. So again, really, just if you're choosing an outsourcer, spend a lot of time on the front end identifying what they're doing on the compliance side and the security side, and that gives you a good roadmap as to whether you're sitting with a good provider or not.
Yep. And so that was a great lead into the other slide that I had that ties into exactly what you just said. It's more and more difficult for us as enterprises to meet compliance requirements. Leverage a partner that can help you do that and help you get there and is making the investment in those kind of things. So I think it's a great example of where we're all limited from a capacity standpoint, both headcount and expertise most likely, and we can leverage that. And then the last thing I just want to share about this is that we have a saying here at ASMGI from our holistic view of cybersecurity that a total solution is a robust security, a meaningful technology platform, that truly addresses the business problem at hand, right? So first you have to identify the problem, certainly, and tie it into the program, but also the operating model that you use, to make sure that all these things are getting done. And there are a lot of different examples we could give on that. So I want to say thank you to everybody for attending. I apologize for running over. We did have a couple of questions. Maybe they got responded to.
Yeah, they were.
But I want to just reach out and mention to the audience that we do have a special offer that we're willing to offer up to the attendees of this webinar, and it's basically, we talked about a lot of different attack vectors and various different things, but the net result of a data breach is that your data probably ends up on the dark web somewhere, and then it becomes part of a marketplace and it's for sale. We have an ability at ASMGI to run some reports that can help you. We're willing to do this free of charge for I'll say a dark web report of account compromise. So if we can plug in your domain name and help you identify if any of the credentials for your domain name are part of any large data breaches that have happened or just really appear anywhere on the dark web. We have a lot of
recently.
Yeah. And so please take advantage of this. If you want, send an email directly to us, and or we can follow up and elaborate on this a little bit more. But it's certainly available to all of you. And thank you again for your participation today. We are definitely out of time, so I'll stop here. I could go for a lot longer. Any closing remarks, Frank?
No, it's just a great topic, and hopefully this has provided some insights into, again, looking back at 2019 and looking forward to 2020, the types of things that every organization should be prepared to deal with.
Yep. Ken, closing remarks.
Steve, just to say thank you for allowing Flex Central to sponsor. Again, great topic, and we look forward to participating with you and the team in the future. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, all. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everybody.
Yep.
Signing off.